New batch, 1934 World Cup, Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia made their debut at the 1934 World Cup in Italy along with 9 other nations. Majority of these nations came from Europe. With the World Cup being in Europe, being in Italy, that piqued the interest of more European nations, unlike the 1930 World Cup, which was hosted in Uruguay in South America. Unlike the 1930 World Cup, this World Cup had a qualifying process, and since 1934, every World Cup has had a qualification round. Czechoslovakia would only have to play one team, and that nation was Poland, both home and away, and whoever had the most points would qualify for the World Cup. The first match was played in Poland, in the Polish Army Stadium, or officially named as the Marshal Joseph Pilsudski Legia Warsaw Stadium. Czechoslovakia would win this game away, beating Poland by 2-1. Josef Silny scored for Czechoslovakia in the 33rd minute to give Czechoslovakia the lead. This would be their first ever goal at a World Cup qualifying match. In the second half though, Poland did equalise. Henryk Martina in the 52nd minute scored, making him Poland's first ever goal scorer at a World Cup qualifying game. However, Czechoslovakia gained the lead again, scoring in the 77th minute. Frantic Peltner scores, giving Czechoslovakia the lead and the win. It's a key away win for Czechoslovakia there over Poland. The next game, however, was not played. I believe the Polish players were not allowed visas by their government to go to Czechoslovakia. And because of this reason, the match didn't take place, and Czechoslovakia was rewarded a 2-0 win. There was a lot of political issues and problems with the two nations, I believe around the 1918, when both nations at that time gained their independence. Something interesting to look up there. But because of this decision made, Czechoslovakia qualified for their very first ever World Cup. A quick mention about Poland, they do qualify for the next World Cup themselves though. Okay, so Czechoslovakia was one of the seeded teams ranked high, and because of this they went up against an unseeded team. That team was one of the original 13 nations that competed at the first World Cup, and that is Romania. Unlike the 1930 World Cup, the 1934 World Cup did not have a group stage. This tournament was a straight up knockout tournament. And unlike the World Cup in 1934, this time around there was a total of 16 teams. And another thing that was different, all 8 ties were played at the same time. So I believe every match played at 4 o'clock on the 27th of May 1934. The match between Czechoslovakia and Romania was played in the Stadio Littorio. The stadium's name has changed a few times, but is currently known as the Stadio Giuseppe Grezza, named after one of the Grand Torino players who passed away during the Superga air disaster in 1949. Stadium is no longer used as a football ground for the team Tristina Calcio, but it is still used as an athletic arena for minor events. So in this game between Czechoslovakia and Romania, Czechoslovakia won 2-1, but would have to come back from behind to win this game. They did it in the second half. First though, Stefan Dobe for Romania, who was actually left out of the 1930 team, scored his first goal for Romania at the World Cup, giving them the lead here. But in the second half, Antonin Puch scores 50th minute to equalise for Czechoslovakia. And with that goal, he becomes Czechoslovakia's first ever goal scorer at the World Cup. And then 17 minutes later, Oldrich Neledley would score his first of 5 goals in this tournament, which would make him the top scorer of the 1934 World Cup. He scores the winner for Czechoslovakia, 2-1. They go through to the quarterfinals. Should also mention that the referee of this game was John Langinus, who was the referee for the 1930 final between Uruguay and Argentina. Mention as well, Romania, just like the 5 other nations that competed at this World Cup and the first World Cup in 1930, all of these nations were knocked out in this round. And with that said, in the quarterfinals, Czechoslovakia went up against Switzerland in the Stadio Benito Mussolini. Yes, named after Benito Mussolini. The stadium has changed its name. The stadium's now known as the Stadio Olimpico Gran Torino, again named after the dominant Torino team in the 1940s, who sadly passed away during 1949 in a disaster. So in this game against Switzerland, Czechoslovakia once again had to come from behind. The first goal was scored in the 18th minute by Keyholes for Switzerland. But 6 minutes later, Czechoslovakia do equalise. František Svoboda scored, equaliser there for Czechoslovakia. So 1-1 in the first half. In the second half though, 4 minutes into the second half, Juri Sobotka scored, now putting Czechoslovakia in the lead over Switzerland in this game. But Willy Jaggi scored in the 78th minute, equalising for Switzerland, now 2-2. And once again, in the 82nd minute, Oldrich Nejedly would give Czechoslovakia the winner, and they reached their first ever World Cup semi-final. So that's back-to-back winning goals from Oldrich Nejedly, who again, as I mentioned, does become the top scorer of this tournament. Alright, so this sets up a semi-final between Czechoslovakia and Germany. The match here was played in a Stadio Nazionale, and for obvious reasons, the name of this stadium has been changed. It was closed and then replaced in the 1950s. The name of the stadium is now known as the Stadio Flaminio. However, it's no longer active, and plans to change it has fallen through. But this was the stadium for the semi-finals, at least one of the semi-finals, and of course the final. This game, this time around for the first time in this tournament, Czechoslovakia do take the lead first. Oldrich Nejedly, of course, scores in the 21st minute. That's 1-0 in the first half. Nowak for Germany do equalise 2 minutes past the hour mark. 62nd minute, they score. 7 minutes later, though, Nejedly scores his second goal in this game, restoring Czechoslovakia's lead against Germany. And in the 80th minute, he would score his last goal of the tournament and his first hat-trick of this tournament. 3-1. Fantastic performance from Nejedly at this tournament. And with that win, Czechoslovakia do reach their first ever World Cup final and their first ever attempt. They go up against the hosts, Italy. Alright, so the same stadium, Stadio Nazionale, in Rome, the capital of Italy. This match would be the very first time 2 European nations would compete at a final. And ever since the 1934 World Cup, a European team has reached a final. I must note that the 1950 match between Brazil and Uruguay wasn't technically a final. It was a decisive match. That tournament didn't have any knockout stages. Okay, so the final, Italy and Czechoslovakia. This game would also be the very first time that a final would go to extra time. No goals were scored in the very first half. Antonin Puch would score again. This is now his second goal of the tournament, scored in the very first game. And I said he was their first ever goal scorer, Czechoslovakia. He scored in the 71st minute for them. But 10 minutes later, Orsi would score Italy's equaliser. He himself also didn't score another goal since his opening 2 goals against the USA. Czechoslovakia was 19 minutes away from winning the World Cup. The game went into extra time, first ever World Cup to do this, or final, first ever World Cup final. Angelo Schiavio, in the 95th minute, gives Italy the lead. This is also the first time he scored since his hat-trick against USA in the opening game, which was the first hat-trick of this tournament. And with that goal, Italy becomes the second nation to ever win the World Cup, and for Czechoslovakia, the second nation to have lost in the final. Very hard for Czechoslovakia there, very unlucky. They did perform very well. Oldrich Nejedly was brilliant too throughout this tournament. Unlucky for him at the end there. The next time that Czechoslovakia and Italy will compete against each other in the tournament, or at the World Cup I should say, would be, funny enough, again when Italy do host the World Cup for a second time in 1990. Again they would lose 2-0. And same city, different stadium, but same city, Rome. And that was in the group stage. As an independent nation, so I should mention that, as most people should know now, I guess, Czechoslovakia is no longer, together. Now it's Czechia and Slovakia. It's been like this since, I believe, the 90s. So, yeah, Italy did play Czechia, or Czech Republic, back in 2006. That was another loss there. Both matches took place in the group stage, and interesting enough, that was Italy on their way to winning another World Cup there, beating Czech Republic at the time. Czechoslovakia do reach another final. They go up against another World Cup giant in Brazil, where they lost 3-1 against Brazil in Chile. Interesting fact about both Brazil and Italy beating Czechoslovakia. For Italy, this was their first ever World Cup, and then Italy do go on to retain the World Cup in 1938. For Brazil, they were the holders of the World Cup, winning it back in Sweden in 1958, beating Sweden, and then they go on to retain the World Cup in 1962 by beating Czechoslovakia. Now, as two separate independent nations, Czechia and Slovakia, both nations have only ever competed at the World Cup on one occasion. Czechia did it first in 2006 in Germany, and then, interesting enough, 4 years later, Slovakia was able to compete at the World Cup in South Africa. But since those World Cups, both nations have failed to qualify for a World Cup. Interested enough about the both nations, Czechia and Slovakia, they have been drawn in the same World Cup qualifying groups, at least for the 1998 World Cup qualifiers and the 2010 World Cup qualifiers. Let's check where they are currently, see where they are, if they will qualify, or if they have a chance of qualifying for the 2026 World Cup in North America. So Slovakia are in Group A. Currently, they haven't played their World Cup qualifying matches yet. True say they are in a group of 4. Groups of 4 at this stage will start their World Cup qualifying campaign in September. They are in a group with Germany, Northern Ireland and Luxembourg. If anything, they do have a good chance to finish second, which would put them in the playoff rounds. For Czech Republic, as I speak, as I've been making this video, they're currently top of their group in Group L. That said, Croatia have 2 games in hand over them, who are second, in the same group as Montenegro, Faroe Islands and Gibraltar. Again, they could end up in the playoff spots most likely. Okay, that was my new batch 1934 World Cup video for Czechoslovakia. Thanks for watching, listening, appreciate it as usual, and once again, bye.